Welcome to this video on Lord of the Flies. The content of this video is going to look at the happenings in chapters 8 and 9 in the book and look at the religious parallels, the Christian religious parallels that we can see in these particular chapters. And whenever I do this book with students, I always say, do you think that William Golding intended the book to have all this religious symbolism in it? And it's always impossible to know what an author intended unless the author comes out and directly says, this is what I meant when I wrote this book. William Golding, in particular, was always very firm in maintaining that he has no idea what the book is about. He just sort of wrote the story, and he never did want to elaborate on any deep meaning or anything symbolic that he might have done intentionally when he wrote the book. So really, we don't know for sure that this is what the author intended, but it's certainly interesting to look at the parallels in the book and to think about what a message might be or what message we can get from it. So let me just say that right from the beginning. So having said that, let's go ahead and take a look at what we see in chapters 8 and 9 and talk about what some of the implications of that might be. So in chapter 8, we see Jack and his hunters creating what we come to call the Lord of the Flies, which is basically killing a pig, cutting off its head, putting the head on the stake. And it's pretty disgusting, and there's flies buzzing around it and everything. And what's especially terrible about this particular kill, and this is not the first pig that they've killed, but what's especially terrible about this particular kill is that it is a mother pig, and not only a mother, a female, but a mother pig with piglets, and so you have it just makes it that much more terrible that it's a mother. And of course, if you're paying attention to the text, you know that the spot where this killing happened is right in front of what we've been calling Simon's special place, the little beautiful clearing up in the woods on the mountain where Simon goes to be alone and meditate and sort of be peaceful. So, of course, after the Lord of the Flies is created, there's that very, very odd scene where the beast appears to be talking to Simon and saying things. And, of course, you probably figured out right away that this was not literal, but rather it's going on in Simon's imagination. So in order for us to really dig into what the Lord of the Flies might represent, we have to look at what it says. Here we have just some samples of things that the Lord of the Flies says to Simon. He says, fancy thinking the beast was something you could hunt and kill. He says, I'm part of you. That's a little disturbing. I'm the reason why it's no go, why things are the way they are. In other words, I'm the reason why things aren't working out, why things are going wrong here on the island. And then he very menacingly says, you know perfectly well you'll only meet me down there, so don't try to escape. And when you think about down there, that can mean a number of things, but we have to remember that this scene is taking place up on the mountain. So down there, more than likely, is referring to the lower part of the island on the beach. So we have that very odd scene happening there. In order to really get an understanding of Simon and where he's coming from, we have to acknowledge that Simon is not like the other kids. He's quiet. He's very, very reserved. He's the only one that seems to feel a need to get away from things that are happening and be alone. He takes every opportunity he can find to go off by himself and be alone, whereas the rest of them very much want the company of others, and they're frightened, and so they want to sort of stay with the big group, but he seems to have no fear or no concern about going off by himself. He's very, very sensitive to his surroundings. He notices beauty. He notices the very small details in the natural things that are happening on the island, butterflies and all these other things. And he needs that place to retreat. And as I mentioned in the other slide, it's really important to remember that this special, beautiful, peaceful place that he has found for himself is ruined because the beast is created, the Lord of Flies is created right outside of that place. So even that little tiny spot that he's found to retreat from all the craziness on the island, even that place is destroyed now. So it almost pushes this very sensitive, very fragile, very emotional child over the edge. He can't function anymore. His sanity has been called into question at various places in the book. In fact, right before the scene. Piggy even says of Simon, he's cracked. He might be cracked. He's crazy. So certainly there's a questionable mental state that he's in. And if you're paying really, really good attention, you may have noticed that when the boys were originally climbing the mountain to try to figure out what the beast was, they were trying to figure out it, what we know was the dead soldier in the parachute. As they're climbing the mountain, Simon sort of has this vision. And it says in the text, however Simon thought of the beast, there arose before his inner sight the picture of a human at once heroic and sick. Now notice it's inner sight, it's not his real sight. So when we see the phrase inner sight, we might think about someone who has visions or is maybe psychic on some level. So that's certainly suggested by the term inner sight. And if we look at what the picture he gets of the beast is and sort of parse it out, it makes a lot of sense. He sees a picture of a human. Is the beast human? Yes, it's the dead soldier. Is the human heroic? Yes. We assume that soldiers, in some sense, are brave and daring and do those type things. Is the human sick? Well, he's as sick as you can get. He's dead. So this picture, even though it may not be exactly on target, it's pretty close. And if you stop and think about the fact that Simon has never seen this creature, the beast, how would he know that? The only explanation for how he could know is because of the gift that he seems to have of some sort of psychic visions, some sort of understanding that goes beyond regular human consciousness. Okay, so certainly somebody who's dealing with those type things can be very fragile mentally and emotionally, and he certainly is. So understanding that about him makes what happens to him make a little bit more sense. So in order for us to carry on talking about this, we have to stop here for a moment and think about theology, think about religious study. So think about names that you've ever heard in your life used for the devil, to name the devil. Certainly, most of us think right away of the term Lucifer, meaning the light bearer. In Puritan times, the devil was referred to as Old Scratch because they believed that when he came to your door to get you, he would scratch on the door to let you know he was there. In Islamic faith, we see the term Iblis used very often. Of course, Satan is very commonly used. And another term that might not be as familiar to you is Beelzebub. And that is a Greek word. And in Greek, it means Lord of the Flies. Now, that should give you pause for just a second. That, of course, is the title of our book. So we have to ask ourselves, knowing that, maybe the beast represents the powers of evil, okay, in a very general, broad sense. So to parse out what that means, let's take a look back at some of the things that the beast says. I pointed some of those out in an earlier slide. Let's go back to those. He says, fancy thinking, oops, went a little bit too far there. Sorry about that. He says, fancy thinking the beast was something you could hunt and kill. If we perceive the beast as evil, the forces of evil, it makes sense that you can't hunt and kill the forces of evil. Because they're far too big and far too wide-reaching. It's not a thing or an animal that you can hunt down and kill and get rid of. The beast says, I'm part of you. Well, if we think about religious theology, we understand that the very nature of human beings is to be bad. Human beings have bad as a part of them. Pretty much every religion tells us that. That's what separates us from gods. That's why we are not God, because we have this evil part of our nature. And I think we would all agree that human beings can be pretty rotten sometimes. So it makes sense for the beast to say, I'm part of you. Evil is part of you. I'm the reason why things are going bad. I think we would agree at this point in the book. Things are breaking down because the boys are doing bad things and letting their evil nature take them over. And then when we look at what happens to Simon in chapter 9, the last line makes a lot of sense. You know perfectly well you only meet me down there. Simon does indeed encounter evil when he goes down to the beach. So it makes sense to think about Lord of the Flies this way. So let's move on. If we think about the existence of evil, if we're thinking about this in a religious way, we have to admit that there has to be good. So if we look at the character of Simon, the character who is directly sort of confronting the beast and coming to an understanding about what the beast is. We can see some parallels between the character of Simon and Jesus in Christian theology. Think about some things that Simon has done throughout the book that are similar to things that Jesus did. There's several episodes of him feeding the multitudes. He gives Piggy food when Piggy doesn't have any. He gets fruit for the children from the trees, and the author describes their hands as being outstretched and they're endless, and he just keeps passing the fruit down to them. He spends time in a beautiful, peaceful, garden-like place before he is sacrificed, similar to what Jesus did in the Bible. He is tempted by the devil. Remember when the beast says to him, "Go back and join the others and we'll forget the whole thing," trying to get Simon to give in to all these things and do what the other kids are doing, but he doesn't do it. Um, he comes to bring good news that will enlighten people. And when he comes down the mountain, he's trying to let the other kids know, hey, there is no beast. You don't have to be scared. It's okay. It's just this dead guy. It's not anything that's going to hurt us. Um, Similar to the way Jesus came to bring the good news of God to the people. And of course, most importantly, he is killed by his own people, just as Jesus was, in a very brutal, cruel way. So we do see a lot of parallels between the life of Jesus and what happens to Simon in the book. And one thing that's important to understand is when we draw these parallels and we say, well, Simon does all these things just as Jesus did, we are not suggesting that Simon is supposed to be Jesus. Sometimes people get very upset and they say, oh, no, that can't be right because Jesus was Jesus, and how can you tell me Simon is Jesus? That's not what I'm saying at all. Christ figures are a very commonly used type of character in literature. You see them in lots of different pieces of literature. And certainly they're not supposed to actually be Christ, because if they had all the similarities, if they were like Christ in every way, then they would be Christ. And of course, there was only one Christ in the terms of the Bible. But Christ figures, rather, when you're talking about literature, they are characters that have similarities to Christ, and we mean that they can be seen as figures who are good and who represent goodness, and who are martyred, who are killed, even though they're innocent, they are destroyed. So when we think about Christ figures, it's probably more appropriate to say they're Christ-like, and not that they are Christ. So I want to make sure I was clear about that. So when we read The Lord of the Flies and we look at this idea of the symbolism of the Lord of the Flies representing evil, Simon representing the forces of good, and being very similar to the story of Jesus, we have to talk about the term allegory. This is this is a literary term that means a story with two levels of meaning. There's a literal level and a figurative level. So when we look at Lord of the Flies, what's going on the literal level is you have all these boys on an island. They're trying to survive. They're going crazy, and they're killing one another, and it's not good. And then if we look at it on a symbolic level, we get that figurative level of the allegory, where we see the classic battle of good versus evil. And if you think about every Disney movie you've ever seen ever, you know that that's a very classic story. Here's something that's good, someone that's good, battling something or someone that is bad. But since we know this is a dystopian novel, it's probably not going to have that happy Disney ending that we're used to seeing, where the good triumphs and evil is defeated. So that remains to be seen, I guess. But I did want you to have an understanding of what an allegory is and how Lord of the Flies can be seen to function as a religious allegory. We have the literal things that are happening, and then we have this level of religious symbolism that those literal things might represent, depending on how we choose to interpret them or look at them. So I hope this has been informative, and thank you very much for watching.